Now we've got the host of Alex Wagner Tonight. Alex Wagner, thanks so much for taking the time.
Oh, thanks for having me on.
So you're the newest host on MSNBC, I believe. With your show, what was important to you? Like what did you see happening in media that you wanted to try and rectify with your show?
I don't know that I'm fixing any of the big existential problems around like linear television, but and honestly, I have a great amount of respect for all my fellow hosts on MSNBC. I used to be at MSNBC a long time ago, and I still very much have admiration and respect and friendships with a lot of the people in the building and on the air. So in some ways, it was a homecoming first and foremost. But I think that we're at a moment as a society when it sort of demands thoughtful conversation and tenacious journalism and unflinching looks at the things that most threaten us, not just as a democracy, but as a species. So that's the kind of stuff that I hope to try and tackle on the program. It's not to say that you're not going to get some of the stuff everywhere else or anywhere else, not everywhere else, but anywhere else. Although I think, the DNA of the show is different than other shows, just by nature of the host, the staff, the way we put everything together for an hour, Tuesday through Friday.
Yeah, and what's important? What's important to you? Like, what's I guess like the most important thread for what you do?
Well, I'm really interested in the questions around identity and how we tell ourselves who we are, whether that's the conversation about race, whether that's a conversation about immigration and who is American and who isn't, whether that's the way culture and our cultural preferences form our, ourselves, our priorities, our goals, our communities. That's pretty nebulous, but I'm really interested in kind of the way, we talk about politics in particular. I think these days is like a sick and cruel game, but I am interested in the poly part of politics. I'm interested in the humanity and the way in which we come together or are driven apart by the sort of issues of the day. So those are the things that I'm interested in.
Is it like especially difficult these days because those issues in particular, the issues of identity, are pretty much the main point of fear-mongering from Republicans? I mean, it's pretty much latching on to issues of identity, whether it's LGBT issues and trans issues or immigration, and like that pretty much is the biggest cudgel that Republicans will wield in their culture war against Democrats.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really toxic. I think it's really unfortunate in a lot of ways.
How do you retain your like faith in humanity and reporting on this stuff when like this is ground zero for all the bullshit?
Yeah, well, listen, I think the reality is that we're in this project called the United States of America together. And I don't think that means you can't call out evil where it exists or name bigotry and racism where it exists. But I also think that we have to sort of understand that all of it, all of the anger and the frustration, somewhere in there, we have to develop the skills of empathy and forgiveness somewhere along the way. I don't know at what point that part comes along, but I think we can't. I know it's just really dangerous to stop seeing each other as human beings. And I don't, listen, it's not to say that every night we talk about, racists being human beings. That's not the focus of the show or not something I'm particularly interested in. But I think we have to kind of break down why it is that people are attracted to this, what it is in society that's pushing us toward that, and also hold accountable the people that that use the cudgel of identity to drive us apart, hold them accountable for what they're doing to us as a country. And I think more than anything, when you hear me really go after, for example, Republican leadership, when they're trying to do bad things for the country, that's not just to, give Republicans a hard time. That's because it's toxic to democracy and the project of America.
How do you work through the media, seeing what you do, which I think from watching is from a progressive point of view, and then seeing, what Tucker Carlson does and just casting it off as, oh, well, this is just both extremes? Like, how do you push back against people lazily labeling everything that isn't abject centrism as extreme or fringe?
Well, yeah. I mean, listen, I always bristle when they try and say that MSNBC is the fox of the left, because nothing can be further from the truth. I mean, first of all, in terms of the standards and the rigor with which we approach journalism and our newscasts, it's not the same as Fox, where facts are treated in a very fungible manner and stories are cherry picked to really, I think, paint a certain worldview and to reinforce negative ideas about certain sectors of society. We don't do that here. You know, I think what we try and focus on is injustice where it exists. And that doesn't make us a bad journalist, nor does it make us crooked journalists. I think it's important work that we do. And I take issue with the idea that somehow we are, playing loosey-goosey with information and facts the way they are at Fox News, or even have the same agenda. I mean, really, when we talk about what's breaking down our society, Fox News is playing a huge role in that, in terms of, breaking down information systems and pitting people against one another. And I think talking about the wrongs and talking about the injustices and talking about the systems of oppression isn't driving people apart. It's helping us look at the problems and try and figure out solutions. I mean, it's not my job as a journalist to propose a policy solution to immigration, but it is my job as a journalist to talk about how people are suffering and the ways in which that system is broken. So I just think we have radically different missions, and I'm very proud to work at MSNBC. And I think what we do is really important for the country.
It's especially telling then that, like when just kind of shining a spotlight onto like the oppressions that people face in this country, it really does like draw into the spotlight the fact that a big part of the Republican agenda is trying to hide those systems of oppression, whether it's from, what we're seeing right now more broadly in the world, and even, earlier in schools with what kids go through and like not learning about slavery and all this stuff, and kind of not having that, not allowing people to develop that schema for like the oppressions that exist, and so that there's no compassion or understanding of exactly that.
Yeah, I think, I've done some work in the field since we launched the show, and we went down to Florida to see firsthand what was happening in terms of Governor DeSantis's curriculum adjustments. Yeah. And that's putting it euphemistically.
A generous.
I think it's really distressing when you talk about the ways in which they're trying to whitewash America's history and really censor. I mean, you talk about cancel culture, the gaslighting on all that is just extraordinary, right? The idea that you cannot talk about race in a way that makes people feel uncomfortable in the state of Florida is absurd. I mean, but more than absurd, it's deeply detrimental to, first of all, having a society that's held accountable for past ills, but also recognizing systemic injustice. And when you go at education, it's a particularly insidious way of ensuring that we won't ever have the conversations that we need to, and that large portions of the population will be kept in the dark as far as the work that needs to be done and the sins of our forefathers. I mean, I think it's really dangerous what he's doing. And I think, the reason I went down there was to shine a light on all of that. The one person can single-handedly battle the very effective governor of a major state in the United States, showing what's happening at the local level is really important, because those are the seeds that, are then grow into the harvest of right-wing extremism that you're seeing today in older segments of the population.
Yeah, I think it's ironic that, when you point out cancel culture, I think numbers just came out like within the last 24 hours that Florida and Texas are the states with the most banned books in the entire country. And so, have you found that there's some awareness within the media more broadly that both sidesism is kind of now like viewed as a permission structure for the right to do whatever they want, knowing that, if a Democrat mispronounces a word, that it'll get equal scathing coverage as when Republicans, incite an insurrection?
I want to be thoughtful about this, because I think there is there's a real desire. First of all, let me just say, from the outset, it's important to talk to Republicans. I wish more of them would come on the show and explain how they, have these views or believe that this policy is the right policy. I wish we could have a more open conversation, a more transparent conversation, but we can't, because they won't come on. the show, and they won't come do most major media. I mean, before this, I worked for a documentary series on Showtime called The Circus. And, it became impossible to book Republican candidates.
Even on that show not all of your co-hosts were Democrats.
Yeah, correct. I mean, even for the Republican in our group, you basically had to sneak up on Republicans on the campaign trail to get time with them. And that's not how it's supposed to work. I mean, these are elected representatives who are supposed to be serving the people. And to not talk to half of the people because you're worried they might ask tough questions is problematic, right? So having said that, it is not that I don't think that Republicans should be asked questions and should be part of the national conversation at all. And I think in part because some media outlets have lost access to Republicans because they'll ask tough questions, there's an overcorrection to try and entreat them to come back into the fold through kind of what one would call centrist journalism. But, I think it's important for journalists to, abide by facts and figures and standards and have a code of ethics. But I also think you can't pretend that terrible things aren't happening asymmetrically politically in this country because you're worried about scaring off elected representatives or Republican voices that you might want to entertain on the show. And to me, that's the most problematic aspect of this return to the center. It's not, I think it handcuffs people from calling out what are egregious missteps, shockingly poor decisions, really deeply unfair and inhumane policy. I mean, these things are what they are on their face. They are not necessarily, made worse so just because they're being proposed by or legislated by Republicans. And as such, as journalists, it's our job to acknowledge that. And when you feel like you have to be muzzled in an effort to appear somehow nonpartisan, I think that's an issue. You have to be able to speak. I mean, you have to not be heavy-handed about it, but to be heavy-handed, you have to be able to speak truth to power. And I don't think some broader nebulous mission should compromise that.
I think what's ironic too about this overcorrection to seem more centrist in a way to appeal to Republicans is that it's not had any effect to make them more sympathetic to those outlets.
Correct.
It's not like you're doing anything. In fact, it does the opposite because then they can say the fake New York Times, which is no less fake than before they ran this story, the fake New York Times is even agreeing with us. And so you kind of kowtow to them in bad faith because you want to draw them back. And at the same time, you validate what everybody can see as bad faith talking points. And so you kind of give them their cake and let them eat it too. And you get nothing in return. And
moreover, it is not as if the party inherently has not recognized how extreme it's gotten, or at least it seems not to have, Kevin McCarthy is making promises to impeach Biden cabinet officials so that he can become Speaker of the House because he has a brewing insurrection from his right flank. I mean, there is, after what is a terrible midterm performance and a Republican nominee in 2024 or potential Republican nominee who is under assault from the by investigations and indictments. There is no course correction apparent on the horizon at all. So this idea that somehow the Republican Party is ameliorating itself and trying to swing back towards a more moderate version of itself is a fantasy. It is the most extreme iteration of itself that we've seen in modern politics.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing to have just lived through an election that was a repudiation of extremism, revert right back to embracing the extremist factions of that same party.
Exactly.
And also, I think something that you're saying, just to agree with this idea that Republicans aren't, how difficult it is to get Republicans to come on. I've had 150 episodes. I've gotten 3, and all 3 of them have effectively disavowed the Republican Party. I've had Adam Kinzinger, who's no longer an elected representative. Jeff Duncan, the Lieutenant Governor of Georgia, who is about as hostile to the MAGA flank of that party as you can get. And then Mike Murphy, who I spoke to just a few days ago.
Can we call him really a Republican?
Yeah, at this point. Although
all Republicans that I speak to as well, and God bless them for wanting to take tough questions to help us understand what is happening in their party or former party, But I do think, it's really telling that oftentimes the only way in which you gain access to a Republican elected official is if they've been primaried, they've been defeated, or they're retiring. And that's that's a problem, that they feel like they can't talk to the larger media audience, or the larger audience of national media, unless they're no longer in power. I mean, that says something about the sort of the handshake that you have to make to stay inside the good graces of the power of the party as it is in power.
And it's also bittersweet for someone like me who's able to do this, like who's had gotten the access to be able to do this by being able to post my own videos onto social media platforms, and the expansion of that media ecosystem. But then at the same time, it's because of that expansion of the media ecosystem that they don't need to come on outlets like mine, because there's a ton of outlets on the right who will just do their bidding. So it's that's like the double-edged sword of all of this. I've been asked this question a lot, and I'm curious as to what your thoughts on it are. But as far as the Trump-DeSantis jockeying is concerned, how do you think that this plays out in 2024?
Well, I think there are a lot of people who are grabbing their buckets of popcorn and ready to watch the blood sport. I think it's going to be ruthless. But I will say, as someone who's seen Trump up close and attended his rallies as part of my work as a journalist, he is an incredibly effective candidate on the stump. And he has a following, an almost cult-like following, for a number of different reasons, some of which owe to the nature of his supporters themselves, but some of which are a result of him as a political operative and a candidate. And he's really good at it. I mean, I'm not gonna go down the sort of moral rabbit hole of Donald Trump and his candidacy, but he is really good at running for office and gaining the support and the momentum necessary to win an election. Ron DeSantis is I think, much more effective governor. He's gotten policy in place that would make even some of Trump's cabinet officials faint. But I don't know, I think woe be to anyone who underestimates the ability of Trump to also, let's just say, pull out weapons from an arsenal that we've never seen used before, but also vanquish potential foes. I mean, he can be not just ruthless, but he is fairly skillful. It's a sort of, it's an innate skillfulness. It's not learned. It's definitely not something that was developed by a strategist. I just think Ron DeSantis could be entering a world of hurt. Though he has the ardor and the enthusiasm of a lot of the GOP elders. And clearly the polling looks very good for him right now. I'm not discounting his position and his prospects for 2024 by any means, but I don't think it's a wrap on Donald Trump, which I think is an obit that a lot of people, for good reason, are probably ready to write.
Right. No, and I completely agree. I've said that, this is something I've said, and I apologize if people watching if they've heard this, but until you kill the guy, he's not dead. And so, people are granting Ron DeSantis the heir apparency, but there's nothing to suggest that any of these people, Ron DeSantis included, have any interest in even taking a swipe at this guy, because they haven't. But just to game this out for a moment, if people recognize the extent to which Donald Trump is an albatross around the Republican Party's necks, they see that he's lost in 2018, 2020, 2022, and it does look like, okay, if we want to win as Republicans, we have to go a different way, and maybe there's a little bit of a fall off in his support, and there is and Ron DeSantis does become the heir apparent in the Republican Party. What do you think happens to the Trump supporters and Donald Trump himself? He's not gonna. Do you see a world in which he allows that he doesn't go full scorched earth, and that he allows allows himself to go quietly into the night?
Yeah. I don't think going quietly into the night is something Donald Trump has ever done. I mean, witness January 6th, 2021. But
it is different, because that's the Democrats, and so at least there's you have plausible.
Oh, but he has no allegiance to the GOP. That's simply a vehicle for his own ego and his own ambitions, right? I think he could easily try and take, the third party route and take. I mean, I think honestly, he's openly and then tacitly suggested to the Republican elders, "I'll take my people with me." So if you want to boot me out of the party, you're booting them out of the party too. And look, they are not the entire Republican Party, but they are a sizable portion of the party that also comes out and votes. They're maybe 25 to 30% of the country, depending on what Donald Trump has recently done and who's ready to pledge allegiance to him. But that's real when you're talking about numbers. And by the way, the country, when it comes down to elections, they're still pretty tight, and there's, the electoral college is a reality. So I think I absolutely think he'll go scorched earth. Nothing in his resume suggests to me that he'll sort of go to the RNC and give an introductory speech to Ron DeSantis as he claims the nomination. It's impossible for me to imagine that.
Yeah. Well, we'll see what happens in terms of these independent runs. It's going to be Donald Trump and Kirsten Sinema leading the country after.
Oh my God! God help us all.
So you mentioned the circus before. I've been a longtime fan of the circus. I'm curious, what was your most memorable day while shooting that show?
Gotta say, talking to the Georgia 3% militia right ahead of Election Day in 2020, where they said that a second civil war was coming and basically outlined the January 6th insurrection, not in specific terms, but just in terms of what supporters were preparing for, what they expected in terms of a Trump victory, and what they thought they would do if Biden was declared the winner. I mean, it was just the explicit nature of that threat was staggering then. And then, of course, on January 6th, it all effectively came to fruition. So, I mean, I'll never forget that conversation. And also, I mean, not just because of the January 6th, but it's rare that you get to talk to people that have gone so deeply to the upside down the rabbit hole, and are literally living in a parallel reality, and are so deeply convinced of it, and it was so disturbing as a member of the news media to have that conversation with them, because it just really so sharply outlined the difficulty of a task at hand, which is to bring people back into the light, the world of facts and information. I mean, a certain segment of the population is gone. And it's almost like they need to be reprogrammed to help them understand that, this paranoid worldview is not actually what's happening in this country and around the world.
Did you ever feel unsafe at any point, like around these people for whom, they're so deeply entrenched in like the toxicity of their politics? And like, I mean, there are people who like commit political violence, and you're like an enemy to those people. So like, at any point, did you feel unsafe, or have you felt unsafe while like doing that show or anything like that?
Well, when you're talking to people one-on-one, I think it's really important to talk to people one-on-one, because you deal with each other as human beings. Like the militia guys were all carrying guns, concealed weapons, but I didn't feel unsafe because I felt like we could each see each other. We were having a conversation as people to people, which that's such a huge part of why we have so many problems. We're not talking to each other anymore. So I didn't feel unsafe with them, and in some ways I would say they were trying to convince me of how wrong I was. You know what I mean? Like in the same way that I was trying to not explain to them, but just try and, convince them that Joe Biden could legitimately win the election. They were in turn trying to convince me that there was just no way that could happen, And so you had this kind of strange interaction where each side was trying to, in their eyes, help the other side understand the truth of things. So I didn't feel threatened then. I think, the times in which I felt threatened for my own safety were probably at large scale rallies where we're not dealing with each other as one-on-one. It's kind of mob mentality. And it's easy to dehumanize someone who's, a brown person with a camera crew and is not someone you're talking to and having a conversation with. And that's where you can see a mob getting whipped up into a frenzy and some kind of violence happening there. But that never came to pass, and I'm lucky that we have a pretty gamey group of documentary filmmakers on the circus crew that were always, down to go into these situations in service of documenting and chronicling the extraordinary political times in which we live.
Okay, so let's finish off with this. As we move forward, I guess if you can interview anyone, who would it be?
I'm sorry. First of all, I'm sorry that like my emails keep popping up.
This is what it's like interviewing an MSNBC anchor in the middle of the afternoon during the work
like week. 4 hours before we go on air. Yeah. I've always wanted to interview John Boehner. John Boehner, if you're listening, please give me some time, just because I think he represented the end of the establishment having any control over the grassroots insurgents of the party, and also is just a fascinating, wine swilling character with, I'm sure, a lot of stories to tell. Of course, I'd love to interview Kristen Sinema just to better understand her logic in all of this and her goals in all of this. And then this person has to be alive, right?
It would be helpful, probably. Yeah.
A Putin. Just because I think, when we talk about the forces of autocracy and the forces of darkness and the demagogues that threaten, the liberal order, he's chief among them and is an increasingly reclusive and dangerous individual. And it would be great to understand how his mind works as well. What a list. What a dinner party.
Yeah, exactly. I think you'd have better luck getting Putin and Boehner before Kirsten Sinema.
Probably.
Which is not exactly a testament to her availability or anything like that. Not exactly a compliment to her. So with that said, Alex, thank you so much for taking the time. And where can my viewers and listeners hear more from you?
You can always tune into MSNBC Tuesdays through Fridays at 9 p.m. to see Alex Wagner Tonight. You can also catch me on my fun little Netflix side project, The Mole. And there is my book, Future Face, on One World Books. And I have a forthcoming title due out, hopefully in 2024 that I can tell you about when I start writing it. Awesome. That will be of interest to anybody who's interested in the radicalization of the Supreme Court.
Very cool. Well, thank you again for taking the time. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Great to talk with you.